Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel and welcome to episode 2 here on my 2024 guide on how to install Klipper with Mainsail OS and KIAUH, or Klipper Installation and Update Helper. In this episode, we are going to flash our mainboard. In this case, I'm using a BigTreeTech Pico. And we are going to put a generic printer config on our Klipper install so that we can connect to it. You can see this is my Raspberry Pi here that I'm using. Something to note here is the BigTreeTech Pico does actually have a power connection here to the Pi, and you can also use this connection here to communicate with a Raspberry Pi via UART. We are not connecting the Raspberry Pi via UART in this episode. That is for an advanced configuration, and we're not going to go into that. I am going to be connecting the Raspberry Pi to USB. So I will run a USB cable here from my mainboard to my Raspberry Pi. So just something to note that. Also something to note in this episode, because we're using a BigTreeTech Pico, there is no SD card slot on this mainboard. This mainboard is flashed via USB-C. So we plug this into our PC with USB-C, copy our firmware onto here, and it automatically flashes itself and reboots. Your mainboard may have an SD card. In that case, you're going to take your klipper.bin file, put it onto the SD card, put it into your mainboard, and power on your mainboard. That's the only real difference in this tutorial is I am using a Pico, which does not have an SD card. The steps, however, will be the same. So let's go on to our Raspberry Pi and let's build the firmware for this mainboard. Okay. Now that I've shown you how I'm connecting to my BigTreeTech Pico and that I am using a BigTreeTech Pico, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go to the GitHub for the mainboard that we're using. It does not matter which mainboard that you're using. 99% of mainboards will have a GitHub, and generally that's the best place to start. These will usually have instructions on how to use the mainboard, and most importantly, instructions on how to flash Klipper for your mainboard. Like I say, my Pico, we're going to be flashing it. It's basically a USB drive when you plug it into a computer and you just copy the file directly to the mainboard. Your mainboard might have an SD card slot. Again, same principle. We're going to be copying our bin file to the SD card, putting it in our mainboard and turning it on, and it will automatically flash Klipper onto your mainboard. So I am on the SKR Pico GitHub page here, as we can see. So the instructions are right here, which are really great. I recommend you reading through the instructions for your mainboard. We're going to go into the Klipper folder here. And then what's really great here is not only does it show you how to connect your Pico to a Raspberry Pi, so this is showing off where the power pins are on a Raspberry Pi. If you're going to power the Pi via the BigTreeTech Pico, you may or may not be doing that. It shows the pinout for your mainboard, in this case the Pico, which is very, very helpful. You can see here how we're going to set up the connection here. We are going to use USB. The BigTreeTech Pico does support UART, which is that connection here that I showed in the first part of this video. However, we are not communicating over UART. We are going to use USB in this particular tutorial. The nice thing about the Pico is it does provide power to the Pi, so you don't need an additional USB power supply. That's just kind of a nice feature of the Pico. But again, we are doing a USB connection to our mainboard. So what we're looking for here is how to build the firmware for our mainboard, in this case the Pico. So you can see here it's showing us basically what settings we need to configure to make the bin file. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to MOBA Xterm here. I'm going to click on my delta.local hostname, and I just need to put in my username here. We've already saved the password on MOBA Xterm. If you're using a PuTTY, you might have to put your password back in. I am going to press the up arrow on my keyboard to run or to give us the last command that I ran, which is launching Klipper installation and update helper. We're going to go ahead and open that. And this is why Klipper installation update helper is so useful. We can really easily get into the flashing menu right from this script. So we are going to press number 4 for advanced. You can see the advanced option right here. We're going to hit enter, and we are going to build only our firmware. So we're going to press number 2, and we're going to build firmware for our main board. So as we can see here on our guide, we need to enable extra low-level configuration options. So to do that, we're going to hit spacebar. We are now going to choose our processor. Choose the processor appropriate for your main board. So in my case, this is based on an RP2040 CPU. So we're going to choose the Raspberry Pi RP2040. In your case, it may be an STM32. And then basically that's it. This is a little bit older picture, so there's more options here. We're going to leave those as is. The Pico is very, very easy to flash because there's very few settings that we need to change here. Do note though, if you are going to communicate over UART, you would change the communication interface from USB to UART. However, we are using USB in this guide. So the only thing we need to do is press Q to quit this and save. This will go ahead and compile our firmware. On the Pi 02, it's a little bit slow, so I will come back to this when it's complete. Okay, so our firmware has finished compiling, and we now have our firmware file. In this case, for the Pico, it's a UF2 file. If you're running a different mainboard, for the most part, it'll be a bin, so a klipper.bin file. And it has told us here where it's located. The nice thing about MOBA Xterm is you can see here, it's showing all the folders available on our Raspberry Pi. This does have file transfer. So what we can do is we can go into the folder where our bin file or our UF2 file is stored. I wish it would say the full path here, but it's just klipper/out and then the file. So just a generic Klipper folder here. We're going to double click that. We're going to go to our out folder. And we can see here we have our klipper.uf2 file, or you may have your klipper.bin file. We can right click on this, download it, and we can just put it into wherever you would prefer. I'm just going to put this into my documents folder. Click OK, and it has now transferred that file to our actual computer that we're on right now. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to take that file and we're going to put it on our Pico. In my case, we can just simply take the file and put it on the Pico. If you're using a mainboard that uses a bin file, you're going to want to rename the bin file to firmware.bin. The note for this though is some mainboards want you to rename that file to a specific name or in a specific way. So check the documentation for your mainboard on what you should be naming your actual file. So once the renaming has been done, you'll take your bin file and you'll put it on your SD card. In my case, I'm going to plug in my I'm going to plug in my Pico into my computer, and I'm going to flash the firmware. The steps for doing that are on the GitHub here. For the Pico, Like I say, it's a little bit special. You're going to be putting a jumper here so that it can be powered on with 5 volts. If it's not out of the printer, of course. Mine is not in the printer, so I'm going to put a jumper here so that when I plug it into my computer, it will power the Pico. And I'm going to actually put on the boot jumper so that basically this shows up as a USB drive. Once I plug it in, I'll copy my file over. As it's showing here, it shows up as a thumb drive and it will flash. So I'm going to go do that and then we'll go on to the next step. All right, so we have now taken our firmware file, we've copied it to our main board in the case of the Pico, or we've copied it to the SD card. We've put the SD card into our main board and we've powered it on. If your settings are correct, it will automatically flash onto your main board in a matter of 10 seconds. A great way to check that it flashed successfully is take the SD card out of your main board, put it back into your computer, and you should see a file on the SD card that now says firmware.cir. That means your bin file has successfully flashed. Now, I don't believe you can still have a bin file that flashes successfully but still can't communicate to your main board if you chose the wrong USB settings or things like that. So definitely make sure you pay attention to the screenshot of your main board. And as an example here, I will go to another main board. This is another common board, the SKR Mini E3. Again, we have a firmware folder here. If we click on firmware, we're going to choose the version of board we're using. Version 3 is now kind of the most common. And we are going to choose the Klipper firmware. Scroll down, and here is the screenshot of the firmware for the SKR Mini. Like I say, it enables low configuration options. We would choose the STM32 processor. You want to choose your processor model. You want to choose your bootloader offset, your crystal, and your USB. Make sure your USB settings are correct here, PA11 and PA12. You can then press Q, hit Y, and it will build a bin file for your main board. Again, I can't stress this enough. Every main board is different and you really need to pay attention to these settings. Otherwise, you will not have a successful flash. So, the next step here is we have successfully flashed our main board. We now need to get our ID so that we can connect to that main board and also confirm that our flash is successful. So, make sure you have a good quality USB data cable so we can have our Raspberry Pi plugged into our main board via USB. Now, some people don't recommend a main board connected to a printer while flashing and doing this kind of thing. The only problem that you could potentially run into is if you just assembled this printer and maybe you have an end stop that's shorted out or something like that and it's preventing your main board from booting, it won't flash. For the most part, you're not going to really have any issues, so you can leave the main board in the printer while flashing. So what we're going to do now is we're still in our advanced menu on Klipper Installation and Update Helper. We're going to get our MCU ID with number 5. So we're going to press number 5 here. We are communicating over USB, so we're going to press 1. And it's now giving us our ID to communicate with this main board. This is very important. This also tells me that Klipper has successfully flashed onto our main board. If you do not get any ID here, you have to go back, double check the steps for your firmware, make sure you built it correctly, and make sure you can flash it onto your main board. Again, I always recommend you use a high quality SD card, and for flashing main boards, I recommend using 8 gig or less. The smaller the SD card, the better. Some main boards don't like large SD cards, and then you have to get into weird partitioning things and settings and whatnot. So I recommend, if you have it, use like the small 256 megabyte SD cards or like a 4 gig SD card or something like that. And try and flash your mainboard again if you're having problems. So the next thing that we need to do now is we need to actually get a config file for our mainboard and see if it will connect. So if we go back to our BigTreeTech Pico, we have here a default blank config file. This config file is not made for any particular printer. It's just a blank config that has all the pins for our mainboard, and then you can customize it afterwards. So what we're going to do, we're going to go to our web interface here, and we're going to connect to our delta.local, and we are going to create our printer.cfg. So I'm going to make this full screen here because we're going to primarily be working here now. And we are going to go to machine, and we're going to create a new file, and that is going to be called printer.cfg. So printer.cfg. Make sure I put a period and not a comma. So we're going to create that printer.cfg. It's going to be blank. We're going to go to our mainboard GitHub, and we are just simply going to copy the information here and paste it into that. So we're going to copy and paste it into our printer.cfg. So like I say, this is not really specific to any printer, but it is specific to your mainboard. So I already know in this case, BigTreeTech assumes you're going to be connecting to your mainboard via UART. So if we scroll down to the bottom here, they have commented out the USB connection. We are going to fix that, and we are going to uncomment that out, and we're going to comment the UART portion. Again, you definitely might not have to do this if you're using an SKR Mini E3 or some other board. We can then take our serial ID that we got from MobaXterm. So I'm just going to open that back up. We're going to do a copy here, just highlight that, go Control-C on my keyboard, and we're going to paste it into here. For the most part, this should be the same ID, but it did change in this case. So you can see the numbers updated here. This is another step some people may get wrong. Sometimes they won't have this dev serial by ID in front. It has to look exactly like this, with the exception of maybe this ID might look different for you. So let's go ahead now and save and restart this and see what happens. So I'm going to click the Save Restart button here in the top right corner, and we're going to see what happens. So we're getting an error here, and I know this is because the BigTreeTech printer.cfg is set up a little bit not generic, and it's complaining about unknown pin name or unknown pin chip name probe. So if we go into our printer.cfg, for this case, BigTreeTech has set this up to be using a probe for Z. It's probably the most common situation. You're going to have a BL Touch or something like that set up, so they've automatically set that up here. For this tutorial though, I'm just going to comment that out, and we're just going to use a normal end stop. And we're going to save and restart. And we'll see what this reports back. So you can see we have connected, but right away Klipper shut down. And we're going to get an error here. This is because my mainboard is not connected to a printer. I do not have thermistors connected to my mainboard. You can get around this if you go back into your printer.cfg and edit your temperatures here. So, you can put in a min temp here of -300 for your extruder. Same thing for your bed. I think you can put -300 in here as well. You could save this if you just want to test the mainboard outside. 300 might be too high. So yeah, this is the max number that we can put in here. So let's just go back and let's plug that in here. I just want to show you what happens if you connect correctly here. as I said, if you already have this mainboard in a printer, it probably will just connect right away. So you can see we've connected now, and our thermistors are showing negative numbers because there's no thermistors plugged in my scenario. You should have proper thermistor readings showing here. All right, the last thing that we need to talk about here is you can see Mainsail is complaining about my configuration. It's saying that it's missing a bunch of configuration here, and that's because we just copied a blank config which didn't include any other config files. So if we go into this config, basically what's going to happen here is this is the first config file Klipper looks at when it's basically starting the service. It's going to go, hey, where's your printer.cfg? And it's going to read that config file right away. With Klipper, you can have multiple config files and load them all in so that Klipper can read them. In this case, we're only loading printer.cfg. If we go back to our config file folder here, you can see we have a mainsail.config, mainsail.cfg. This contains all of those macros and configs that it's complaining about. So all we need to do is we need to include this config file in our printer.cfg. So we're going to just go up to the top here. Normally these will be up at the top to make it nice and convenient. So in here we're going to do a bracket. We're going to type include MainSail.cfg. So we're including this additional config file when the Klipper service starts. So let's save and restart this. You can see Klipper has started and all of our warnings are gone. At this point, you can now go ahead and start using your printer. Or if this is a custom printer, you're going to now be going into the printer.cfg and customizing this. If you guys want me to run through kind of a basic config file, let me know. I could possibly make a part 3 to this series, but as you can see in 2 simple episodes, we fully installed Klipper and connected it to our mainboard successfully. Thanks everyone for watching, and like, share, and comment below. Thanks.